The game was introduced at the NBA All-Star game in Salt Lake City in '93. So you had a lot of NBA players there, of course. Players started asking how they could get one. One of those players was Shaq. It was really interesting. Shaq bought 2 games right off the bat. He had one at home, but one they actually traveled with on the team plane. It's kind of a funny thing to imagine, this game getting wheeled out of the team jet into, each hotel room night after night after night. Hi, this is Mark Turmell, the designer and lead programmer on NBA Jam. And this is how we overcame the chaos and challenges to release NBA Jam. Showtime! Well, I started making video games when I was 15 or 16 years old. First playing on a mainframe computer at a local college, Zork and Adventure, text-based games. And then I bought an Apple II computer, which allowed me to learn how to program in assembly language, which is really needed to get the performance. It took me a while to introduce my first game. Sneakers came out, and I went on to do Atari 2600 VCS cartridges. And eventually, when the video game business kind of hit the wall, I decided to shift my attention to the coin-op business, which still had real opportunities. And so I joined Williams Electronics in 1989. I started at Williams with the intent to make a dual joystick game. So I created a game called Smash TV that had dual joysticks. Robotron is my favorite game of all time from Eugene Jarvis. A good friend of mine now, he was kind of my mentor at Midway. And then after that, I moved on. I did a Total Carnage, which is another dual joystick, but we were all kind of geeking out on the digitized graphics concept, the new technology, if you will. So we kind of broke off to do Mortal Kombat. Trog was kind of a claymation, digitized looking game. Strike Force was another Defender style game. A lot of games kind of percolating up from this group of 25, 30 people. I started NBA Jam. The NBA had never licensed a game to the arcade space before. Trying to get them to approve their logo going into an arcade, we sent a video of our kind of work in progress movement, characters moving left and right on a court. No crowd, no stands, no NBA players, 2 hoops and a ground plane. And we sent that and we explained kind of our design, kind of a 1-page overview, 2-on-2 dunks, passes, 4-player cabinet. And they immediately came back and said no. Inside Times Square, there were a lot of arcades. Some of our best test locations for all of our games were there. But it was a kind of a rough crowd, kind of a seedy location, 24 hours a day. They weren't sure they wanted their logo in that type of a location. So we actually created another videotape showing typical family entertainment centers, bowling alleys, the big arcades out in the suburbs. Lo and behold, they responded with yes. They would be fine putting their logo into those types of locations. So we were off to the races with a whole nother challenge of how to get NBA players now into this game. Of course, the most popular team was the Chicago Bulls. It was during the Michael Jordan era. Jordan and Pippen were the 2 members in NBA Jam, and they were just dominating. We had all these stats that we would track. They were clearly the winner. We weren't sure if the game was successful just because we were in Chicago, or if this would be a nationwide thing. But right before we launched the game, the NBA reached out to us and said that Michael Jordan had just removed himself from all licensing of the NBA, thinking that he could go off on his own and make more money than splitting his percentage equally with all players in the NBA. And so we had to remove Jordan from the game. And of course, it didn't matter. The game was still a blockbuster success. But there are still some games out there with Michael Jordan in the game. All of our test location games and also some custom ROMs that are out there floating around with Jordan still in the game. So we launched the game without Jordan, But it was only a few weeks later before I got a message from an operator, a distributor of games. A young rookie named Gary Payton was upset that he wasn't in the game. He actually reached out and said, how do I get in this game? We did a special version of the game with Gary Payton. He was in subsequent releases, but he initially was in his own private game. He was friends with Ken Griffey Jr., who was friends with Michael Jordan. Ken Griffey wanted to be in the game, so we had Ken Griffey in the game as a custom set of ROMs. And so then Jordan said, okay, I want this too. So we put Jordan back in the game and we gave him the custom set of EPROMs so that he could be in the game for himself. So NBA Jam had numerous challenges, some really significant challenges. So here's how we tackled solving those problems. We wanted to have digitized characters to make it look more realistic. We had to figure out how to record basketball players doing these moves. You know, it's kind of funny to think about digitized graphics as being cutting edge. Back then, in the late 80s, 1990, the idea of putting a digitized image onto the screen was really unheard of. It was difficult because there's a lot more memory required to represent an object. You need more color depth, more pixels. Previous to that, all games were hand-drawn graphics, starting with early Pac-Man style games, onward. It was always an artist generating really detailed images of a character running or walking or jumping. So when you think about those early games, most things were hand-drawn. But Atari came out with a fighting game called Pit Fighter. And they used very coarse digitized images of some punches. They followed that up with a game called Primal Rage, I believe it was called, where they kind of did claymation dinosaurs. And so all of these companies were starting to try to get some digital element to maybe ease their development process or just to be more cutting edge. Trying to get digitized characters into the game, we were total noobs. We knew that weather reporters would stand in front of a blue screen to do their weather report. And that was about the limit of our understanding. With digitized graphics, we were able to take a photograph or a video and transfer it into digital images that we could then display as a sprite on the screen. It's 2D, but the images come from a videotape session, and then we chose the frames for running or dunking or passing. Even though it's digitized to begin with, we still had the memory footprint problem where we had to choose and select our frames carefully. I went into the inner city of Chicago and I found some basketball players that were out on the streets, on the parks, that looked like they had a lot of flashy moves, looked really good. And we rented a warehouse. We painted the wall blue. We realized we could do blue or green, so we did this blue screen. We brought the athletes in. We ordered these uniforms, a gray set of uniforms that these characters would wear, these basketball players I had found. But the uniforms came in and they were blue. And so we had no time to repaint, and we're paying for studio time and the guys are there. So we recorded their moves. We created a little dolly system to follow along a player who was dribbling and doing crossovers. We had a portable hoop. And so we basically tackled this shoot for 2 or 3 days, getting as many moves as we could. We documented everything. And then we had, of course, the challenge of what do we do with all that footage? And so we had all these tapes that then had to get converted into digitized graphics. We eventually bought a big treadmill, I think they used for exercising horses. And we had the players running on this treadmill and even trying to dribble and kind of spin around, just so that we could record from one perspective to keep everything consistent. And we eventually had to hand trim out from the background every single player and every single move, every single frame that we wanted to use from these videotape sessions. because the blue screen obviously didn't magically disappear for us. So we had to do the manual labor of creating those frames from the videotape. So once we had these players in the game running back and forth, then we got the NBA license, and we had to figure out how to transfer the real players onto our players. So we chopped off the heads from all of those frames that we had clipped out from those recording sessions. And we went about the effort of taking every NBA player that we were going to put in the game, which is 2 per team. We looked at all of the frames, the different running and jumping and face up, down, left, right, and we came up with a sheet of these are really the heads, the only set of heads we need for the entire set of animations. We embarked on trying to find those exact images based on looking at videotapes, recording NBA games, looking at magazine shots, and trying to then lift those images from whatever the source was so we could put them onto our headless bodies. And so every frame of animation, it could be a pass. On this frame, use this head. On this frame, use this head. This frame, use this head. And so we had to painstakingly select which of the 13 heads to apply to every single frame for every single animation. Another challenge was players expected these players to all be distinct. If you were John Stockton, you expected to be able to steal the ball. If you were Shaq, you knew you couldn't make a three-point shot. So there was a really large built-in expectation from our players. We had no stats for the players, and we found in the arcades, as this game went on to test, that players expected their player to act the way they did in real life. And so it became a real challenge for us to convert these players into what the players expect, what the video game players would expect. We worked on trying to put stats into the game. We had to go back. We did this at like 2 in the morning one night. We put in the little stats numbers, came up with 8 different stats that each player would encompass. That would inflect how fast they could run, their shooting percentages, their dunk ability, their stealing, deflections. We implemented all of these little tables all the way through the code. Anywhere that could be inflected, we added it. In the end, it was really a smart decision because players really recognized it, and it brought this extra layer of strategy and gamesmanship to our players because they knew that if they had this combination, it would be better than that combination. They're the type that prefers to be fast, not strong, a good shooter or a good dunker. So it brought in a lot of added strategy to the gameplay itself. So one of the interesting things about the arcade business is that we would test the game on location. We'd sit back, we'd watch. We wouldn't, tell the player who we were. This kid walked up to the machine, but there are 4 start buttons, much like you see here on this control panel. The player stepped up and he hit the player 2 start button, and he positioned himself at position number 3. His controls were over here, but he was playing on the wrong controls. I was so embarrassed that I stepped up to him and I said, "Hey, I think you're actually on player number 2." And he's like, "Oh, okay." And he stepped over to position number 2, and I was like, "Oh, what a mess." And then after about 30 seconds, he stepped back over to position number 3 because he thought he was being more successful over there, which was a drone player running back and forth and scoring and dunking. And so he was not interacting with the game at all and preferred that. So that was a pretty big red flag for us. Players are moving around fast. There's AI moving around fast. Everybody's got similar flesh colors. Trying to help the player identify who they were controlling, who their teammate was a real challenge for players and a challenge for the development team. The solution for that was we went back to the office and we created what I called bozo boxes. When you start the game now, there's a vertical panel that shows up right over your station on the control panel. And it says, "You are Pippin. Your shoes are red. You only control Pippin." That allowed us to educate the player because he wasn't sure if he would pass and take over control of another character or, whoever had the ball, it was him. That's not the way NBA Jam works. So we had to educate the player with these bozo boxes, changing the shoe color, changing the turbo meter color to make sure that players would recognize who they were, even to the point of choosing the players on the team, the roster, a taller guy or a shorter guy or different flesh tones, trying to make it easier for the player to recognize on the screen in this fast action who they were. Another thing NBA Jam is well known for is the big head mode. It's funny, you get a chance to see these NBA players up close, but really the genesis of that was that we needed players to understand who they were even more than their shoes or their color. And so big head mode really was back to player communication. The AI, the way players move, was a real challenge because if you had them moving too successfully or making too many good moves, it was a problem. If they didn't move where you'd expect them to move, it was a problem. NBA Jam costs 50 cents per period, $2 for a full game. Of course, we wanted players to play it all the way out. But if they were ahead by, say, 7 points at the end of the first quarter, we would not get them to pay that extra 50 cents. If they were behind by 7 points, they would quit and maybe start over from the start, choose a different team. And so that led us to CPU assistance. CPU assistance is what a lot of games have done over the years, driving games, you catch up from behind. It was really particularly important to NBA Jam, and it was too obvious at the end of the day to the players, but it was really important for us to rubber band the scores back and forth to make sure that it was a competitive match. We didn't want players to run ahead. We didn't want players to fall way behind because we knew we'd lose money in that circumstance. And so we created this idea of the on fire mode, and on fire changed everything. We allowed the player to start heating up after he made 2 shots. The third shot he would catch on fire, his ball would have flames on it, he would burn the hoop, and he would shoot like 99% three-point shots. He could goaltend on the defensive end, and it changed the strategy of the game dramatically. Because now, when you started to heat up, or your teammate recognized that you were heating up, they were trying to feed you the ball because it had to be a streak for that one, consistent player. When an opponent was heating up, you stopped trying to make three-point shots. You wanted to go in there and score, do an easy dunk. If your opponent was already on fire, you certainly didn't want to go down and take a three-point shot because he could goaltend your shot and get away with a legal goaltend. So you would change your strategy to go in there and knock somebody down and do a simple dunk which extinguishes the fire. So the on fire mode became this solution for the disparity of scores and to let people come from behind. And it layered in the strategy that we didn't really even anticipate. The key lesson that I learned right off the bat from NBA Jam was that a competitive game was magic. From that point forward, I never made any solo experienced games. It was always head-to-head competitive.
This is bad, man. This is bad.
Trying to get somebody excited on their own is hard to do. When you have 2 players and they're talking trash to each other or one guy's better than the other, it brings a whole nother layer of excitement to the player. The rubber banding and the tight scores made things more exciting, and that spans different genres. Racing games obviously do it. They try to keep things tight. Sports games do it. Even on a match 3 game, if you have a tight score, it's a more exciting circumstance for the player. You know, being from Michigan originally, I'm a big Detroit Pistons fan. Making this game in Chicago during the height of the Michael Jordan era, there was a big rivalry, you know, the Pistons and the Bulls. But the one way that I could get back at the Bulls once they got over the hump was to affect their skills against the Pistons in NBA Jam. And so I put in special code that if the Bulls were taking last-second shots against the Pistons, they would miss those shots. And so if you're ever playing the game, make sure you pick the Pistons over the Bulls. In the end, NBA Jam was a monster hit. We sold about 27,000 arcade cabinets. The game ended up earning about $1 billion in quarters, 1 quarter at a time, in its first 12 months. And that is pretty staggering when you think about E.T. had come out and become the #1 film of all time, and it was like, 300 million. And so to have $1 billion go into the coin box in 1 year set a record that we were pretty proud of. I think all game developers encounter problems. What my advice would be is to, take it one bite at a time. In my company now, we always have a saying, how do you eat an elephant? And the answer is one bite at a time. Sometimes it's easy to get overwhelmed with the number of challenges and problems, popping up all over the place, feedback coming from all these different angles. But you just have to tackle one thing at a time, make that right, and then, move outward. And so I learned a lot there in 1992, 1993, making NBA Jam.